Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they sang murder three? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in that hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkansas Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm Chris James, your host. Tonight we are going to be talking about UFOs. It is December 30th, 2017. The year is coming to a close. You have 30 hours to take care of those New Year's resolutions you made last year. You better get cracking. Time is almost up. Last year, I said I was going to exercise less and sit on the couch watching TV more. Like all good resolutions, I didn't do either one. I'm thinking I should say that in 2018, I'm going to make less money and spend more. Maybe I won't do either one, like always. 4,000 years ago, ancient Babylonians would make promises to live a more spiritual life. The new year was also when the new king would be crowned or the old one would be reconfirmed. In Rome, the magistrates would all go before the Senate and swear they were doing their jobs correctly. Any new magistrates would also be sworn in on New Year's Day. In 1740, John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, invented a new type of service. These services were called covenant renewal services or watch night services. They were held during the Christmas and New Year's season as an alternative to the holiday partying that was going on. Today, everyone wants to live a better life, make better decisions than last year, and spend less money and take better care of yourselves. Since most folks will not fulfill their New Year's resolutions, why not resolve to do something you know you won't do? That way you won't be so disappointed this time next year. The UFOs have been seen in the skies for as far back as recorded time. Back in ancient times, people who saw something up in the sky would describe it using whatever terminology they had. A flying saucer might have been described as being a flying shield. Back in the 300s BC, Alexander the Great saw several flying shields that dove on his troops. The UFOs caused a lot of difficulty with his men when the elephants they were riding became terrified and they began running around, stomping on anyone in their paths. The word disc was used back then, but being a soldier, he was more inclined to use words associated with war rather than eating. The Hopi Indians have legends of flying shields that were coming from cities at the bottom of the seas. This brings to mind the concept that if aliens wanted to live here on our planet undisturbed by us, the bottom of the ocean is about the most remote place they could find. 12 men have walked on the surface of the moon, but only 3 have ever visited the deepest parts of the ocean. So, if you're willing to look, you can find thousands of references to things being seen that fall into the unidentified sightings of UFOs. They're unidentified and they're flying. Back when you had to work all day if you wanted to eat, there wasn't much time to sit back and look up at the sky and say, I wonder what those lights are. As time went by, some folks accumulated enough wealth. They had time to do things like ponder the strange things being seen all over the planet. If you were looking into weird lights in the sky and saucer-shaped flying craft, you were considered to be either a scholar or a scientist. In 1235, Japanese General Uratusan and his men were camped out for the night when they spotted a bunch of lights moving around in the sky. The lights would move around in bizarre patterns, circling each other and swooping back and forth, and sometimes they would disappear behind the mountains on the horizon. The general called for his biggest and brightest men to look into the lights and find out what they were. The very first UFO investigation was underway. The men spent a few days trying to determine what the lights were before reporting back to General Uratusan, whatever the guy's name was, that the lights were just stars being blown about by the wind. This sounds just like our skeptics today, trying to explain away UFOs as swamp gas or pelicans. It would seem the investigators didn't have a clue, so they just made something up to appease the general. Around the Middle Ages, when people were busy killing anyone considered slightly weird, no one wanted to be different, and so most people kept their heads down and they didn't talk about any strange things they might have seen in the sky. Everything was either witchcraft or satanic. And some of the monks continued writing about flying objects. In 1254, on New Year's Day in St. Albans, England, several monks reported seeing a large ship hovering in the sky over their church. It lit up the sky with bright-colored lights. After hanging in the sky for several minutes, the craft rose up into the sky before it faded from sight. In 1290, in Bayland Abbey in Yorkshire, England, a group of monks witnessed a huge flying disc. It was silver and it moved around without making any kind of a sound. August 7th, 1566, the entire town of Basel, Switzerland, watched as hundreds of flying balls flew through the air. The balls looked like they were in some kind of a battle with each other. From 1896 to 1897, there were dozens of what were known as airships sighted all over the United States. The airship had been invented in 1852 by Henry Giffard in France. His airship was 143 feet long, and it was shaped like a cigar. The craft was filled with gas, giving it lift, and propelled by a 3-horsepower steam engine. This early attempt at air travel was way underpowered, and it could only go a short distance. The most any of these airships could carry was maybe one person, and 2 if they weren't too big. If some entrepreneur had been building airships here in the United States, why is there no record of it up until the 1900s? March 26, 1880, in Galisteo Junction in New Mexico, some men were working at a train station when they heard voices coming from the sky above. They looked up and they saw an enormous flying craft that they described as looking kind of like a fish, and it was passing overhead. The men said they could see the occupants of the craft. There were 10 men who looked very much like humans. These men were looking out the windows of the craft, and they were looking right at the men on the ground. One of the occupants tossed something out of the window of the airship. It turned out to be a flower wrapped in a piece of paper. The paper had writing on it that no one was able to decipher. They said the writing looked similar to Japanese writing. The craft was traveling from the west, heading east at a fairly good pace, and it sailed away into the night. And I'm going to take a brief pause here and play a couple commercials, so don't go away. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. Coffee, nectar of the gods. And at the Organic Man Coffee Trike, you'll find coffee made the right way, one delicious cup at a time. Stop on by 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. And remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. Did you hear a bump in the night and you think it just might be a ghost? Contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com. That's the LPRS for all your otherworldly needs. This is Arkanasa Radio you've been listening to. And welcome back to the show. We're talking about UFOs, a few sightings from the past, and we'll get to a few sightings from this year as well. If you were a UFO investigator back at the time, about the only evidence you would have is the witness's testimony. A few people had cameras, and it would have been impossible to get a picture of a moving craft. You'd have gotten nothing but a blur on your lens. The newspaper reporters were just about the only form of UFO investigators going on. One of these men would travel to the scene, where he would interview any of the witnesses, if they were willing to talk about what they'd seen. The reporter would write up the incident, and he'd send it off to the paper by telegram. If the editor liked the story, it would appear in the next day's newspaper. If, on the other hand, it was a busy week, and say the president had been shot or war had been declared, the UFO story might have wound up being thrown in the trash can. This would have been the only form of written record of the incident. How many UFO cases wound up being discarded due to there not being enough space on the front page or the middle pages of the paper? Nobody considered these reports to be jokes, but they weren't exactly front-page news stories either. They still took them seriously, but sometimes they just didn't make it into the paper. The government took an interest in UFO reports around the time of the Aurora incident. In 1897, an airship was spotted flying over the town of Aurora, Texas, just north of Fort Worth. As the craft was moving through the air, it collided with a windmill on one of the ranches. The townspeople all gathered at the crash site, where they found a strange passenger in the wreckage. An Army officer who'd come to the scene from Fort Worth looked at the body. He said it was not from Earth. It might have been from Mars. At the time, nobody from the Army rushed in to declare the witnesses were all drunk or misguided. The evidence was not whisked away to be studied at some place like Patterson Airfield, later to become Wright-Patterson Air Base. The body was buried in Aurora Cemetery. The grave marker had what looked like a flying saucer etched into it, but somebody broke the headstone in half and took the inscribed image away. The remains of the airship were all dumped into a well. 1937, something crashed into the countryside in the south end of Germany near the Switzerland border. The people living in Huenberg saw a light in the sky that came down and disappeared into the trees near town. The German army arrived shortly, and they found a flying disc or a saucer had come down in the woods. They recovered the flying disc and carted it away for study. The incident's name was shortened to Huenbu for some reason. From then on, the craft was referred to as the Huenbu device. They got busy reverse engineering the craft and soon had acquired a new form of technology. Shortly, the German army began developing some advanced weaponry. They improved their airplane engines, and they developed rocketry to a high degree. Some folks say the Germans were using advanced technology from outer space to advance their war industry. True, this advanced technology was kept secret from the public. If you wanted to win a war, you didn't talk about your abilities, you used them. World War II led to a lot of UFO sightings and a lot of government cover-ups. The Allies began bombing German positions in 1940. The British were trying to destroy Germany's ability to wage war by destroying all of their factories. Most bombings took place at night, so the German fighters would have a hard time spotting the bombers. Now, England only had a few bombers, and so there weren't that many eyes in the sky. But by 1944, after the United States had entered the war, things had taken a major turn. Thousands of bomber crews were in the air, and the crews began to report some strange things. As they were flying over Europe, the crews began to see strange lights in the sky. These lights would follow the aircraft, and sometimes they'd get really close. Many of the crewmen were nervous, and they would fire at the lights, thinking they might be German secret weapons. A .50 caliber round will make a mess out of anything it hits, but the air crews all found their firepower did nothing to this mysterious aircraft. Once on the ground, all the crews would be questioned as to what they'd seen, both in the air and on the ground. This information would lead to intelligence that could possibly turn the tide of war. Well, the crews all began telling about these strange lights. For some unknown reason, the men doing the questioning began to ridicule the air crews, saying they were seeing things or they were mistaken. Of course, none of the Army investigators ever volunteered to fly over Europe in order to see these lights for themselves. Well, it didn't take long for word to spread among the air crews. If you see those lights, don't tell the guys from Intel. Just a side note, for those of us living in Laredo, Texas, during World War II, some B-17 air crews were shipped to Laredo Army Airfield for training. The crews would be loaded into a deuce and a half and driven out to the east of town. There, they would have to stand in the rear of the truck as it bounced along a ranch road. As the truck was moving through the brush, targets would come into view, and the crewmen would have to engage them. The .50 and .30 caliber bullets were fired out into the countryside at an alarming rate. The area where these training exercises took place is on private property, but you can still find piles of spent rounds laying in the brush. In my book, Saucers, I tell a fictional story that takes place at the Army airfield. It's about flying saucers that are attacking Laredo. Check it out if you're interested at Amazon.com. The book is called Saucers by Chris James. I thought it was a good story, and you might too. Over Europe, in the middle of the bombing runs, these weird lights continued to follow, and some said they were beginning to harass the B-17 crews as they flew through the night. During one night mission over Europe, Donald Myers, a radar operator in the 415th Night Fighter Squadron, spotted a bright light following their airplane. The pilot began evasive maneuvers, trying to shake this unknown object. The light managed to stay on their tail, and the aircrew were all convinced this was their last night on Earth. But somehow they managed to make it back to England, and during the debriefing, Myers pulled a copy of the comic strip Smokey Stover from his pocket. He slammed it down on the desk and said it was one of those Foo Fighters. From then on, the name Foo Fighter was used by all of the airmen. In the comic strip, Smokey Stover, Smokey would often say, "Where there's Foo, there's fire." It was a very popular comic strip back in its day, and a lot of the air crews were quite fond of it. The Allied High Command had had a change of heart sometime after this, and they began referring to the Foo Fighters as secret German aircraft. As the reports were now being seriously taken, the Allies began to get them from all over the place. B-24 crews flying out of North Africa said they were seeing these same balls of light. Once the war had come to a conclusion, the German and Japanese air crews began to tell similar stories. They had run-ins with these same balls of light, and they had all thought that they were Allies using some form of secret weapon. Neither side knew what those balls of lights were. There were no reports of any aircraft ever falling afoul of the Foo Fighters, but with thousands of aircraft missing all around the world, there's no way to say for sure that the Foo Fighters were not possibly a hostile force. Once World War II had come to a close and all the soldiers and sailors had returned home, UFO sightings began to trickle in. Who do you report your UFO sighting to if you're no longer in the military? Well, how about calling the nearest Army airfield? As more and more people began to have access to telephones, more and more sightings were being reported to the military. The Cold War was getting cranked up. People were watching the skies, waiting for the coming communist invasion that was being talked about by the press. On some nights, the local air base would receive so many reports, their switchboard would become overloaded. Something needed to be done, and done quickly. The commanding officers in Washington began to worry. If there were a UFO sighting being reported that swamped the phone lines, and those commies decided that it was time to launch an invasion at the same time, there would be no way to contact the air bases to let them know it was time to defend their country. The Air Force had come into being in 1947, just 2 months after the crash at the Roswell. A Project Sign was begun as a means of looking into UFO sightings. The Project Sign was quickly replaced by Project Grudge in 1949. The Project Grudge was a haphazard attempt to look into UFOs, and many of the generals in the Air Force considered it to be nothing but a joke. At the general's insistence, Project Grudge was closed down, and it was promptly replaced by Project Blue Book, which ran from 1949 until January 1970. The name Blue Book came from the covers of test booklets being used in some colleges. The name was supposed to show people that the Air Force was taking the investigation seriously this time. They wanted to know what there was to find out about UFOs and why they were here. January 1953, the CIA recommended a group of scientists and advisors come up with a way to lessen the number of sighting reports. They weren't interested in finding out what UFOs were. They wanted to keep the public from making so many reports. They wanted to keep the air bases from being flooded with hundreds of telephone calls, which would have blocked the commanding officer's ability to sound the alarm should they need to. At the insistence of the CIA, the Robertson's panel was put into action. They considered the threat from the USSR to be considered the only problem facing the United States at the time, and so UFOs should all be ignored. At least that's what they told the public. There's nothing to see here. Go on about your business. Now, the folks that were being abducted didn't think this was much help. A new policy was initiated. Heap ridicule on people who said they saw a flying saucer. Interview people on TV and the radio who would appear to be less than intelligent, so the public would begin to think that only crazy people were seeing UFOs. At the same time, Project Blue Book lost most of their ability to investigate UFO reports. The staff was switched out, putting in people who mostly had a bias against the subject they were supposed to be studying. UFO reports were no longer looked into to determine what they were, but they were looked at in order to explain them away. Dr. J. Allen Hynek was the only scientist who worked on Project Sign, Project Grudge, and Project Blue Book. His job was to look at the reports, dissect the information, and determine what the sightings might have been. By 1960, Dr. Hynek began to notice he was seeing a lot of reports from all over the country. Reports from farmers and school teachers, police officers and construction workers. But he began to wonder why he never saw any reports from pilots or military personnel. He asked Major Quintanilla, where were all the reports from the pilots and the soldiers? People who were either right there in the sky or out late at night in remote locations. Well, Major Quintanilla told Dr. Hynek, those reports are all classified. Classified? If there were reports coming in that Dr. Hynek couldn't look into, then who was looking into them? After all, he was the Air Force's top scientist. I'm going to take a brief pause here, play a couple commercials, so don't go away. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Are you taking care of your skin, or are you going to wait and see how time treats you? Take care today by contacting Lourdes James, Independent Beauty Consultant, at 956-723-3019. Don't let time get the best of you. Coffee makes the world go round, and around here we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike, 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. If you're not looking for coffee, try their tea. It's the best in town. And remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee. If you need to squint and hold things out at arm's length to see them, maybe you should get your eyes checked. Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, is right across from the Embassy Suites. Let's stop squinting and start seeing. You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. Be sure and check out the majesticalcryptid.net for all your cryptozoological needs. Now, getting back to Dr. Hynek, the doctor began to disagree with the findings of Project Blue Book. This seems odd considering he had been hired to look into sightings and tell the Air Force what they were, but the Air Force was only giving him reports that they didn't take seriously. So, now the Air Force was no longer taking his advice. 1966, Congress commenced the Condon Committee. The man in charge of the committee said from the very beginning he thought looking into flying saucers was a waste of time and money. The committee looked into only a chosen few UFO reports, which they quickly decided were most likely misidentifications. The people just don't know what they're looking at. A memo that had come out of the Condon report was known as the Lowe Memo. On August 9, 1966, Lowe had written to two University of Colorado administrators, assuring them that they could expect the study to determine that UFO observations had no basis in reality. In late January 1967, Condon said in a lecture that he thought the government should not study UFOs because the subject was nonsense. He then added, "But I'm not supposed to reach that conclusion for another year." So he'd already made up his mind long before looking at most of the evidence. The final report, which cost the government $50,000, and that was back in the 60s, it said that Project Blue Book only found 3% of the UFO sightings that could not be identified. At least that's what Condon said. In fact, it was more like 30% of the cases that were unsolved, and the better the witness was, the more likely the case was unidentified. Well, Condon recommended that the Air Force stop looking into UFOs. Project Blue Book was closed down January 1970. Well, Dr. Hynek went on to form his own UFO research group, and he looked into flying saucers and other anomalies until his death in 1986. Now today, if you should see a flying saucer, and you call the local Air Force base, they will tell you to contact the National UFO Reporting Center, who have been doing the Air Force's job since 1969. Peter Davenport runs the center. You can check it out at www.ufocenter.com. I'll put a link on my Facebook page after the show. The people were now being preached to as to why UFOs and flying saucers were just products of the imagination. The skeptics began to rally with their favorite mantra, "They can't get here from there." The skeptics all began talking about how the nearest star system, which could possibly have inhabited planets, was Proxima Centauri, which is a mere 4.37 light-years from Earth. A light-year is the distance light will travel in 1 year, which comes to 5.9 trillion, that's with a T, miles. So Proxima Centauri is 25.7 trillion miles away. The skeptics will tell you there's just no way anyone can fly from that far in their entire lifetime. See, the aliens are supposed to be commuting back and forth on a daily basis or something. There are even cartoons showing little flying saucers zipping back and forth through the cosmos. So the government no longer looks into unidentified flying objects. According to the New York Times, the folks in Washington are spending $22 million just this year studying aircraft that didn't match any known flying vehicles in a program known as the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, which the Department of Defense has decided, or had decided, to shut down back in 2012. For a no longer functioning program, it sure is getting a lot of cash. So the Air Force is no longer looking into UFOs, but the Department of Defense is. I wonder which branch of the military is getting all that money. Maybe it's going to the Space Rangers, or how about the Men in Black? Now, the way I look at it, the aliens don't go back and forth. UFOs have been seen in the skies for thousands of years. Perhaps a few thousand years ago, a group of aliens packed their gear and climbed aboard a gigantic spaceship. It may have taken them generations to get here. Maybe they were mad at their neighbors, or maybe their neighbors had run them off. The whole idea here is that the aliens took their time getting here, but once they arrived in our solar system, they stayed. Maybe the mothership is in orbit around one of our neighboring planets. It could be parked on the dark side of the moon, or maybe even inside of it, for all we know. My favorite place would be the bottom of the oceans. Those little flying discs are like fighter jets that land and take off from aircraft carriers. Let's face it, jets crash all the time, but you never hear of an aircraft carrier crashing. Now, should the aliens be sitting at the bottom of the ocean, and their great-great-great-grand ancestors had landed there way, way back in ancient times, can we still refer to them as aliens? The Earth being rich in minerals, the aliens might be here looking for gold or some other mineral they need or want for their own purposes. Maybe there are several alien craft circling our solar system, each with a different purpose in mind. They say there are at least a dozen different types of aliens. Now, we tend to give the alien life forms the exact same thought process as ourselves. Maybe the aliens think along different lines of reasoning. We don't know, and we really can't say for sure until one or more of these visitors from another galaxy comes forward and tells us what it is they want with our little planet. Let's look at some of the shapes of the craft. The original shapes seem to be round like flying shields. A shield looks a lot like a saucer. Well, then there was the cigar-shaped flying craft. If you look at a saucer stood on its side, it would take on the appearance of a cigar. So maybe all those cigar-shaped craft were actually just saucers seen at an angle. Back in the days when Alexander the Great was having saucers seen in his area, his soldiers were seeing them as well. They would have known what a shield looked like from any angle. Perhaps they saw something that looked like the edge of a shield, in other words, a cigar shape, and they said it looked like a shield that was stood on an angle. Now, the soldiers reported the sightings. The scholars would write it down. What's that you said? The edge of a shield? I'll just write down it looked like a shield. Back in 1949, all UFOs were being called flying discs. There were a few triangles as well. April 1949, a flying triangle was sighted over Vicksburg, Mississippi. The Air Force looked into the sighting, and they even filed a report on it. This was back before the Robertson panel had decided we didn't need to know about UFOs. 1952, a huge blue-green triangle was seen flying over Europe. A NATO exercise was underway, and the entire combined military forces of 9 different countries all saw this craft. 1965, a squadron of flying triangles were spotted over Yorkshire, England. The triangles looked to be illuminated from underneath. So it would appear that the shape of UFOs haven't really changed all that much over the years. It's only the reports that most people are hearing that seem different. Let's face it, a lot of sightings don't get mentioned in the mainstream media, so we don't really know what all is being seen. I personally have had 2 UFO sightings. Both times I saw lights in the sky that were not airplanes or stars. The first time I was out on Mines Road. It was about 11 at night. I was looking up at the stars because it was a clear night, and it was a very impressive view. I noticed a formation of lights. These lights were a lot brighter than the stars, and they were stationary. They were in what kind of looked like a circle. I guess they were maybe over Catarina or Carrizo Springs, and they were pretty high up in the sky. There were maybe 7 to 10 lights. One would blink on and off. And then 2 would blink on and off at the same time. Each one would blink a few times. This sighting took about a minute before the lights all blinked out and I didn't see anything anymore. As I stood there staring up at the sky, a truck driver stopped right next to me. He jumped out and he asked if I had been watching that light show as well. He asked if I knew what they were. Well, I had no idea. We stood there looking at the spot where we'd both seen the lights. The next day I did file a report with MUFON, and I talked to one of their field investigators. There have been quite a few reports from around the area. Some might say the UFOs were sending down some kind of a signal. Why would an advanced race of being use semaphores to communicate? Then again, who knows what those blinking lights might have been used for? All I can say is I saw them, and so did that truck driver. The trouble with seeing mysterious lights in the sky is that all you can do is see them. They don't leave behind any trace of their passing. Even if you get a photograph, the skeptics will just say, oh, that's just Venus or Mars or maybe even a meteorite. This next story comes from a friend of mine, Officer James Boyd, while doing some archaeological research in Tamaulipas, Mexico. I'm going to read what he said in his own words, just as he wrote it down. I've been a police officer since 1993. My background, field of study, is astronomy and archaeology. My 10-year-old son and I were camped at a remote ranch in northern Tamaulipas, Mexico. The purpose of our visit to the ranch was archaeological exploration of an Indian campsite, which I have been exploring regularly since 1982. The ranch is located on the Rio Grande, about 5 miles northwest of the city of Zapata, Texas. Our campsite was located on a small plateau about a half-mile west of the river. For those of you unfamiliar with the area, the river runs from north to south. When you enter into Mexico, you would be traveling west. We arrived at the ranch, the Rancho San Fabian, late in the afternoon of April 16th, 1999. We managed to get in about an hour and a half of exploration before we had to proceed to our campsite to get set up for the night ahead. We planned to spend the entire next day exploring the myriad archaeological sites on the ranch. This ranch is very remote, and the nearest Mexican city is Nuevo Laredo, some 40 to 45 miles north. In 1999, there still was no electricity on the ranch. My archaeological field notes for the date in question, 4/16/99, indicate that my son and I started gathering firewood in the area of the camp. but I left briefly to gather more wood a short distance from the camp. Upon my arrival, my son reported a close encounter with a coyote while I was gone. We started a campfire, the only light in this very dark area. The fire was started at about 8:30. My notes indicate that it was a very pleasant evening, and an owl was heard hooting in the area. A few minutes after getting a roaring fire going, I noticed a bright cluster of white lights low in the southwest sky, a few degrees above the horizon. There is a north to south trending ridge that runs about a half mile west of our campsite. Otherwise, the view of the sky is uninhibited. The only trees in the immediate vicinity are low, thorny mesquite trees. The cluster of lights were obviously moving, but I was unsure how far away they were. The lights appeared to be getting slowly closer, and they traveled on a course that led them into a point due west of our campsite. At one point, I realized the lights were getting much brighter, and I suddenly realized they were moving directly towards our position on the barren plateau. My first thought was that the lights were from a Mexican military helicopter, and they had spotted our campfire. However, I strained to hear the sound of helicopter rotors, but there was no sound to be heard. I still believed it was a helicopter and the object was getting much closer. I expressed my concern to my son that the perceived military helicopter might attempt to land at our campsite. He became obviously distressed, and I ordered him to flee with me into the brush just east of our campsite. The area we fled to was in a gully that runs on the east edge of the plateau where our camp is located. My intent was to take cover in the darkness away from the brilliantly illuminated campsite. There are a few rogue members of the Mexican military with less than admirable morals or scruples. They have been known to enhance their income by robbing tourists found in an out-of-the-way location. James and his son couldn't have been in a less vulnerable position. Back to his story. However, it did not take long to realize that there was no sound, and the lights, a V-shaped assemblage of 5 quite bright lights with a slight yellowish tinge, appeared to be affixed to a triangular-shaped aircraft that was flying directly towards us. The point of the V was oriented in the direction the object was flying. The object traveled at an unknown height from west to east, to a point approximately 75 degrees above the west horizon. My son and I were hunkered down in the brush, quite amazed at what we were seeing and not hearing. The object banked slowly left, which took it to the north, and angled in a direction generally towards the distant city of Nuevo Laredo. At its closest approach, the object stretched approximately 10 to 12 degrees at maximum width. The object then began banking slowly towards the northwest horizon, and it soon disappeared from sight. It is noteworthy that the object was more difficult to see after its closest approach to our camp. The lights appeared to be blocked somewhat by the object itself after it began to fly away from our location. My son and I soon returned back to our campsite, where our vehicle was parked, a few yards from the campfire. We discussed what we had seen for a while, quite mystified. However, the necessary chores still needed to be performed, and we attended to these duties, including preparing supper and generally organizing our camp. We kept a close eye on the sky, and I made a note that the skies were clear and very dark and transparent. The stars were clearly visible all the way down the horizon. The M13 globular star cluster in Hercules was easily visible to the unaided eye. The M51 Whirlpool Galaxy in Ursa Major was easily visible in my 10 by 50 binoculars. I also noted that the Omega Centauri globular star cluster, low above the southern horizon, was very bright to the unaided eye and partially resolved into stars with the 1050s. I also noted that during the evening hours, My son and I observed and heard numerous high-flying large jets traversing the sky in a north to south direction, several miles west of our campsite. This is along a well-traveled route used by airliners and large freight jets. These fly at about 30,000 feet during their long journeys to southern destinations. Additional notes indicate that it was a quite cool night away from the campfire, necessitating the use of a light jacket. I noted that my son Jeremy finally went to sleep in the truck at about 11, and I followed at about midnight. My son was so impressed by the object we had seen that the following day, while still at the ranch, he made a sketch of it. However, his sketch shows a triangular-shaped object with 7 to 9 lights on its leading edge, whereas the actual object we saw had 5 lights, with 1 at the apex of the forward point, and 2 lights on the leading edge of each rearward trending edge. We have spoken about the sighting of the strange object many times in the intervening years, but the memory of the event is still quite vivid in my mind. It is enhanced by the fact that the notes about the incident were incorporated into my archaeological field journal at the time. Expedition number 687. I have been interested in astronomy since 1974 and have watched the sky regularly since then. I am quite familiar with the various objects in the sky, both natural and man-made. I am also familiar with most types of conventional aircraft, and this was most certainly not one of those. I am certain that it was a single craft, but I don't know its origin. I would be inclined to believe that it may have been a high-tech experimental aircraft, but what troubles me is why such a craft would be operating over this remote and not very extraordinary part of Tamaulipas, Mexico. There is nothing of a strategic nature anywhere in the region save the U.S.-Mexican border itself. And this is the end of his story. The officer told me he still thinks the object he saw was some kind of a military craft, but, once again, what would it be doing cruising into Mexico? Here in the last year, there have been a number of UFO sightings, and some of them have even made it into the news. I received a report from an anonymous source who said they were driving on the south side of Laredo when they saw a triangle flying overhead. It is about 6:30 and just a little bit dark out. The craft was moving slowly, heading north. The underside had 5 lights, 2 along each side and 1 towards the middle. The lights looked as if they were made up of many smaller lights, all in one place. It was hard to judge the size with nothing around to compare it to, but it looked a lot bigger than a passenger airplane. It made no sound as it was passing. This sighting sounds a lot like the triangle Ishmael had seen back in 2010. In January, a man spotted a whole fleet of UFOs over Southgate, California. The fleet appears to be just a bunch of glowing balls of light floating up in the sky. Now, you might want to think these are just balloons, but they maintained the formation as they moved across the sky. All the orbs stayed in their position with the exception of one that zips about from one end of the bunch to the other. In Springfield, Missouri, 2 men watched as a flying triangle passed over their heads at about 8 o'clock at night. This took place in February. The triangle looked a lot bigger than an ordinary airplane. It slowly faded from sight. The men thought that perhaps it had passed behind a cloud. The triangle was being followed by a single light, and this also slowly faded from sight. In June, in Richmond, Virginia, a man witnessed a black object that remained in one position up in the sky. It looked black, and it was kind of shaped like a cone. The long end was pointed down towards the ground. The man got his cell phone out, and he took a video of the object. On closer examination, it appears that the cone is rotating. The object was in the same place for about 10 minutes. Another driver also saw the object, but had no interest in knowing what it was or why it was there. Could it have been a balloon? How would a balloon stay in one place for nearly 10 minutes? Well, how about a drone? Once more, how would it stay in place? So, it was unidentified, and it was flying. It was a UFO. In August, lights were back over Phoenix, Arizona. The lights, or orbs, are in a flattened-out W formation. After a few seconds, the central orb begins moving towards the top of the frame. The other orbs fall in behind it, forming a kind of a triangle as it moves out of sight. What could behave like this? Balloons don't cooperate like this. Drones would have needed a massive computerized program to pull this off. If this were aliens, what are they doing? Here's just a thought. How about they're setting up some kind of an electromagnetic grid as they fly over the planet, looking for some underground mineral deposits, kind of like a giant flying metal detector. Now, in December, down in Brazil, a UFO watcher spotted two huge glowing lights in the sky. As he was filming them, it looks as if smaller lights were being expelled from the rear of both of these larger lights. Some folks are trying to explain away the flying triangles as being a government aircraft called the TR-3B, which is supposed to be a triangular-shaped nuclear-powered aircraft. If this is the case, why are they flying it over Laredo? Why not use some of that real estate they own out in Nevada, which amounts to 86% of the state? They should call Nevada Federalada, with 110,567 square miles of state. 95,000 square miles is controlled by the government. Several folks have asked why flying saucers need running lights. You don't need lights in outer space, so why are UFOs lit up? One theory I've come across said the light seen coming from a UFO is more than likely a production of whatever kind of power is being used to propel the ship. Have you ever seen a jet using its afterburner? It spits out a flame that looks like a blowtorch. Maybe the light we see is actually simply the product of the energy being expelled from the craft, and it shows up as light. The UFOs spotted in the daytime seem to be illuminated as well, so this would pretty much rule out the idea of using navigational lights. Now, I know that some sightings can be explained as being misidentification. There are thousands of aircraft flying about on occasion, and one might look just a little bit weird. Then, of course, there are the hoaxers who will build a flying saucer and send it into the sky hoping to make a few minutes on the news report. I can neither confirm nor deny that I might have been involved in one such hoax back when I was quite young, as in 12. It was the neighbor kid, actually. He was the one who used sparklers and helium balloons. I was just there. Or maybe I wasn't. Then there are the sightings that just won't be explained. The UFOs seen by Kenneth Arnold near Mount Rainier were said to be a flock of pelicans. The thing that crashed at Roswell, well, that was a weather balloon, which Major Marcel couldn't identify, despite the fact that he had just returned from radar school. Swamp gas and lighthouses have all been hustled out and thrown on us as if we were all too dense to know what we're seeing. A lot of people will believe these outlandish explanations because if they don't, then they have to admit that just maybe flying saucers are here. Well, I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. Tell your friends. After all, the show is free. If you get a chance, go to Amazon.com and pick up one of my books. I have everything from horror to humor. You can visit our archives at strangethings.podomatic.com. If you'd like to contact us, write to strangethings@arkanasa.com. Happy New Year to everybody, and I'll be talking to y'all again in 2018.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they sang murder 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Back in 1776, someone said, "Give me coffee or give me death." And if that's how you feel, you should be at the Organic Man Coffee Trike. They make coffee the right way, one delicious cup at a time. 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. Coffee, the stuff dreams are made of.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murdered 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?